Here we go. So if we want to start off with a right royal story, of course, we need to start off with the real king, who is King Bibi, pictured here with the royal emperor Putin and Nama Yisachar. And how did Bibi do this deal? Well, if you read newspapers like I do, like Haaretz, for example, what Bibi did, he sold off bits of Jerusalem to Putin in return for Nama Yisachar being released from prison. If you believe that, you believe it. If you don't believe it, you don't believe it. But even if he did that, he wouldn't have been the first prime minister to sell off bits of Jerusalem. Here is Ehud Olmert, who in 2008, he sold off Sergei's courtyard, or rather he gave Sergei's courtyard back to Putin. What is Sergei's courtyard? It is one piece of the Russian compound in Jerusalem, which is 68 dunam of prime real estate, basically between the Spitz, the corner of the old city, and Jaffa Gate. It's around where the city council buildings are. And if you want to visit the Russian compound properly, you either have to be a Russian pilgrim, in which case you can go into the very beautiful Holy Trinity Church, or you can commit some heinous crime and the police will arrest you and take you to the Russian compound, which is the main police lockup. There are all kinds of other buildings there. And in 1964, the Israeli government did the deal of the century, whereby they bought the whole shebang for $3.5 million US, which they paid for in oranges. No joke, they really did. So it really was the deal of the century. But how did the Russian compound become known as the Russian compound? Well, to answer that question, we need to go back about 100 years to the Crimean War, which was fought in 1853 between the Ottoman Empire with their allies, the British and the French, against those pesky Russians. And it was a particularly brutal war. Conditions were appalling. In fact, far more soldiers died of disease and famine than actually were killed on the battlefield. But when the war ended, the Ottomans felt beholden to their allies, the British and the French, and they gave them capitulations, which is a continuation of reforms in the Ottoman Empire, which had started about 30 years before. And what these capitulations were, they were essentially the first consuls or embassies, whereby foreign powers like the British, the French, the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans, and even the Russians could buy up bits of real estate. And within that real estate, Russian, British, German, or whatever law would apply. Very much today, as we know from embassies and consulates. And that's how the Russian compound became sovereign Russian territory until it was sold in 1964. In 1880, the Russians are coming. Russian peasants would walk through Russia, through the cold of Russia, to Odessa, where they would get on a ship and would sail in dark and filthy holds to the promised land. There they would stay in the Russian compound, where they would live in overcrowded dormitories for 3 pence a day, eating kasha, which was cabbage soup, and drinking mugs of kvass root beer. In fact, business in Russian pilgrims was so good that Arab boys ran alongside shouting in Russian, "Muscovites are good." Of course, whilst the Russians were coming, here you see Russians on the Temple Mount crowding into the Holy Sepulchre. They would shout about mysterious passengers on board the ship. And mysterious passengers on the ship. And this would be Jesus, who had come to make the pilgrimage with them. Or they would claim to have seen Jesus at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Here you see some pictures. This is Christian Russian pilgrims at the Jordan River. But in Mother Russia also, changes were afloat. In 1861, the Tsar, Alexander II, he launched a liberalization campaign, to basically liberate the serfs. And it was so successful that in 1881, he was finally assassinated by an assassin that threw a bomb and blew his legs off. He was replaced by Alexander III, who was a bearded giant, and he decided, of course, to reverse the reforms. And who did he blame for the demise of his predecessor? Of course, he blamed the Jews, and he coined the phrase that would become so popular of pogrom, from the Russian gromit, to destroy. In 1882, he basically made anti-Semitism state policy. And Alexander III believed that Mother Russia would be saved by both autocracy and orthodoxy. So he encouraged pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and he appointed his brother, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, he appointed him as president of the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society, who were basically managing all the aforementioned pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Sergei, who was brother of the Tsar, he married a beautiful German princess whose name was Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna. And here you see a picture of them. And in 1888, Sergei and his young 23-year-old wife, who was known as Ella, they would also come on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And they would stay in Sergei's compound, the same compound that would be sold in 2008 by Ehud Olmert to Putin. But anyway, Ella was so moved by the whole experience, she wrote to her grandmother, who was Queen Victoria, and she wrote, "When entering the Holy Sepulchre, it's such an intense joy being here. My thoughts constantly turn to you." Ella and Sergei were also builders. They commissioned the building of a beautiful church on the Mount of Olives. Here you see the church about 100 years ago, and here you see the church as it is today, the Church of Mary Magdalene, which is very distinguishable and very noticeable in Jerusalem by, of course, its gold-topped baubles. And Ella Sergei designed the church, and Ella was involved in commissioning of the paintings. And Ella wrote to Queen Victoria and said, she said, "It is such a dream to see all the places where our Lord suffered, and such an intense comfort to pray here." Well, Alexander III was impressed by his brother. In 1891, he appointed him as a governor general of Moscow, and Sergei immediately expelled 20,000 Jews from the city on Erev Pesach. They were surrounded by Cossacks and police, and they were expelled, and a lot of them, I'm sure, met their death as well. And Ella wrote, she said, "I can't believe we won't be judged for this in the future, but Sergei believes this is for our security. I see nothing in it but shame." And it took some time, but indeed Sergei, perhaps he was judged for it. And in 1904, he met his end. He was assassinated by a bomb in the Kremlin. And this is his assassin, Ivan Kalyayev, sorry about my Russian pronunciation. And of course, he was hung. But the event posted something of a trauma in in Ella, the wife of Sergei, and she now became even more religious. By the way, she was, as I mentioned, she was a German princess, so she was born a Protestant, but she had adopted the religion of the Russians, the Russian Orthodox Church, and she now dedicated her life for working for a convent of, here you see her dressed as a nun, and she dedicated the rest of her life working with the poor and the needy and the starving in Moscow, of which there were plenty. But in 1917, as we know, the Russians revolted, the Bolshevik revolution, and Ella was taken together with her sister Alexandra, who had married the Tsar Nicholas, and the whole of the Romanov family was taken to a mine shaft in Alpievsk, where the whole family was thrown down a mine shaft. and just to make sure they were all dead, grenades were lobbed in and they were blown to pieces. About a year later, in the middle of the Russian Civil War between the White Russians and the Red Russians, the White Russians actually overtook the area. They discovered the grave, and the bones of Ella were smuggled out in a simple wooden coffin and was sent by rail to Peking in China. And from Peking, her bones came to the Holy Land, and she was interned and buried in the Mary Magdalene Church on the Mount of Olives, which she had helped design. The whole burial was carried out in extreme secrecy because there was a fear that Russian sympathizers in Palestine, and the Russian sympathizers, the Bolshevik sympathizers, were Jews in Palestine. And it's true that members of the Second Aliyah were definitely Bolshevik sympathizers, and it was thought that they would sabotage the burial of Ella. Enough of Ella, and now a little bit about her niece. Who was her niece? Her niece was another German princess. She was born Victoria Alice, and she was born, actually she was born in Windsor Castle, but she was, and her great-grandmother was still alive. Queen Victoria was still alive at the time. Her parents were German princes and princesses of Battenberg, and she grew up in Germany. It was noticed by one of her aunts that her development was somewhat slow, and they realized even in that time that the reason that she walked slowly and she spoke very slowly was because she had congenital deafness from birth. Despite this, however, she managed to overcome her disability. She learned how to lip read, not just in English, but also to lip read in German and in French. And in 1904, the family looked for, of course, all the royal families of Russia, Germany, and Great Britain. All the cousins, they all married each other. They certainly didn't marry actresses and certainly not Canadian actresses either. They married within the family. But for Princess Alice, she married into the Greek royal family, and here she is seen in 1904 with her suitor, Prince Andreas of Greece. Unfortunately, her marriage was a rather unhappy one. She bore 5 children, 4 girls and a boy. But her husband was a rather unlikable character. He was a military officer, and he was not at home at all. He didn't look after his wife. He pursued his military career, and he cavorted and had affairs with a large number of women, and also apparently with a large number of men as well. He was a bisexual, and basically he lived his life outside Greece, in Monte Carlo or wherever he wanted to be. Also, the royal crown in Greece was extremely unstable. There were wars fought by Greece in the Balkans before the First World War. Greece stayed neutral within the First World War, but there was a bloody war with the Turks after the First World War ended in the early 1920s. And the king, who was Prince Andreas's brother, King Constantine, had to abdicate the throne twice. And eventually, in 1923, the whole family fled from Greece and moved to Paris. In 1928, Princess Alice took upon herself the Greek Orthodox religion. And it was about this time, towards the end of the 1920s, that she became ill. Perhaps this was something of a consequence of her deafness, who knows? But she started having conversations with the Lord Jesus. And in 1930, one day, her children were removed from the house. Her youngest son, Philip, was taken for a day trip, and her mother packed her off into a car against her will and sent her off to a sanatorium in Switzerland, where she would be treated for her schizophrenia. The doctors that treated her would take advice from Sigmund Freud, who was elderly but still alive, and the way that they treated her schizophrenia was to treat her by making her go through premature menopause. It was thought that by bombarding her sexual organs with X-rays and causing her to go into the menopause, this would end her libido, end her love affair for Jesus Christ. Well, for the 2.5 years that she was in a sanatorium, she wasn't allowed to see her children. Her husband, who you see here, was completely estranged, had no interest in seeing her at all, had completely washed his hands of her. And it was only after 2.5 years that she was released from the sanatorium. For the next 5 years, she drifted around Germany, basically completely poverty-stricken. And it wasn't until 1938 that she would go back to Greece as Greece restored the monarchy. Greece would enter the war on the side of the Allies. Initially, they fought mainly against the Italians, but in April of 1941, the Germans would march into Athens, and here you see a picture of the swastika being hoisted above the Acropolis. What was Princess Alice doing? Mainly during this period, she was working for the Red Cross and looking again after the poor and the needy, and she would also found a Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary, the same name that was the name of the convent of her aunt, who was the Duchess Ella, who we mentioned previously. By the way, maybe I forgot to mention, they met on various occasions, and Alice very much loved and was close to her aunt. The war ended, and in 1947, there was a wedding in London, and here you see a picture of the groom and the bride, Prince Philip, who was the youngest son of Princess Alice, and he'd done rather well for himself. He was in Britain during the war, and he fought in the Royal Navy, and he fell in love with a young princess, Princess Elizabeth, who would become Queen Elizabeth, and happily married they are to this day. His mother, here you see her in a simple nun's uniform, and she must have been quite a shock to Londoners in those days who had never really heard of her. By the way, there's a famous anecdote of Philip when he was shown round Windsor Castle, and a cheeky footman said to him, was explaining the layout of the castle, and he said to the footman, you know, you don't need to do this because my mother was born here, much to the surprise of the footman. But the Philip's 4 sisters, Princess Cecile, Theodora, Margarita, and Sophia, none of them were at the wedding. Princess Cecile was dead. She died in an air crash in 1937, and the picture that I sent you earlier today of Prince Philip surrounded by Nazis was Prince Philip in Germany in 1937, where he went to attend her funeral. The other 3 sisters, in the period that their mother was in the sanatorium, they all married German princes who were all involved in the German war effort in one way or another. Princess Sophia was married to a high-ranking German officer who held a rank in the German Waffen-SS, and who was involved, I think mainly he was involved in the Ministry of the Air Force during the war. But I saw various clippings that she, by the way, there are pictures of her with Göring and Hitler, who she met before the war, perhaps not surprisingly. And apparently she named her son Karl Adolf in admiration for that nice man, Adolf Hitler. I'm not sure how true that is, and I'll come on to that in a moment. So Princess Alice dedicated her life to her Christian works. She stayed in Athens in the late 1940s, the 1950s, 1960s. By 1967, her health was failing, and Queen Elizabeth sent a plane to collect her from Athens and bring her to Buckingham Palace, where she lived the last 2 years of her life, happily chain-smoking cigarettes around Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. She died in 1969, and she was buried at Windsor Great Chapel in Windsor Castle. And it would take until the mid-1980s, I think it was 1980, can't remember, it was 1984 and 1988, that her will to be buried in the Holy Land alongside her beloved aunt, the Duchess Ella, at the Mary Magdalene Church on the Mount of Olives was fulfilled. And here you see Prince Charles visiting the grave of his grandmother. Prince Charles has visited her at least twice. Once at Shimon Peres's funeral, and recently also he was there at the anniversary at Yad Vashem. Okay, just to complete Princess Alice's story, here you see in not just Charles visited, William was here as well in 2018, but in 1994 there was a visit of Prince Philip, and together with his sister, Princess George of Hanover. By the way, Princess George of Hanover is after Prince George, which was her second marriage, and this is the same Princess Sophia that married the German prince that would be in the Waffen-SS. And this is then pictured together at Yad Vashem when their mother, Princess Alice, was made one of the righteous among the nations. Why was she given that award? Because in 1941, she hid the Cohen family. Here you see a picture of the family. Actually, underneath, at the bottom, you see a picture of Chaim or Chayamki Cohen. He was an advisor to the Greek king, King George, who was the father of Prince Andreas, who was married to Princess Alice. And apparently the king had told the Cohen family that if ever they were in trouble, they would be given protection by the royal family. And in 1941, when the Germans moved in, they, as we know, they destroyed Greek Jewry, and the light of Greek Jewry, Thessaloniki, all the Jews there were deported to Auschwitz. Somehow the Cohen family managed, Chaimki was already dead at that period. Some of the children got out and went to Egypt, but Rachel, his widow, was still alive. And together with one of her children, Tilda, they came to Athens, and they sought the protection of Princess Alice to protect them and hide them from the Nazis. Princess Alice had never met them, but she was convinced by this story, and for 1 year, until the Allies would liberate Athens, she held them safe and hid them from the Germans. There is an anecdote which is told, I don't know how true it is, but it's said that Princess Alice was actually questioned by the Gestapo, and she used her deafness as a way of protecting herself, either not understanding the Gestapo's questions or telling them that, how could she be hiding some Jews? So she was a remarkable woman, and apparently one of the things that she said, they tell me she was not afraid either of the Germans. She wandered about Athens during the Second World War. Athens was also a dangerous place in various revolts that occurred after the Second World War. She wasn't afraid of anything. She wandered the streets. And apparently she said, they tell me that you don't hear the shot that kills you. And in any case, I am deaf. So why worry about that? That is the end of tonight's story. You're all unmuted.